Well, good morning and good afternoon for those who are in Europe. My name is Heidi and I work in Quarks safety. And today I will present you two big regulations, REACH and TSCA. It will be just an overview, and I will try to compare, looking for similarities and differences between them. We are in the first Chemical Safety Day 2020 in English. So thank you to be here. I will start with a chemical context in the world, and then I will do a small introduction to TSCA and REACH. After I will explain separately a little bit about TSCA, REACH, and I will end with a conclusion comparing both legislations. So when we talk about classification, we have the globally harmonized system that allows to classify chemicals, and it was adopted by Europe, like CLP, classification, labeling and packaging, and also in Japan and China and US. And to improve the research on classification, we have also many organizations doing scientific evaluation of chemicals like YARC and others. And we also have other business sectors with regulations for cosmetic restrictions, food contact, water contact. But if you want to go to market, you must be compliant with TSCA in US, REACH in Europe. And a few years ago, we saw appear also in Japan and in China and Korea regulations that wanted to compare REACH, to go through the same way. So, which are the main goals of REACH? It's important to know that REACH means registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. And the main goals are to protect human health and environment, maintaining competitive and innovative chemical industry, and of course, to allow the free movement of substances in the internal market. When we are talking about TSCA, TSCA means Toxic Substance Control Act, that already say that they want to control toxic substance, but not only toxic substance. Their goal is to imply manufacturers and processors control chemicals in the market, mostly of course chemicals that present an unreasonable risk to health and environment. And they want also to do this without creating barriers to technical innovation. When we are talking about REACH, REACH it's a regulation, so it's really huge. We have 15 titles and 17 annexes. Most of them, they have a list of different kinds of substances. We'll talk a little bit later. And it applies to all the European countries from the European community. And TSCA will apply it's a title of the United States Code, also with a lot of the 29 sections and really hard with a lot of requirements. And it's applied to the United States member and jurisdiction. When we are talking about administration, REACH is administered by the ECHA, the European Chemical Agency, that was created to administrate, to manage REACH. But today, the ECHA will manage also 7 other regulations, all related to chemicals, like the classification, labeling and packaging, biocidal, waste framework, import and export, and also everything related to risk assessment, directive, carcinogenic and mutagenic. Today, the ECHA has 106 6,000 almost notifications, or in the inventory we have this quantity of substances. When we are talking about TSCA, TSCA will be managed by the Environmental Protection Agency that is older than TSCA, but not so much, and that will also manage the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, everything related with environment. The inventory, the TSCA inventory counts today with 86,000 chemicals, but only 41,000 are active, are in market. So like you see, TSCA is older than REACH, but before REACH, we had something in Europe too. We had also a list of substances in market and a list of notified substances, and approximately 40 directives in Europe. We also had a directive of restrictions, and that's why the reason that the European community decided to create only one regulation, and they gave 3 volume-based registration deadlines to allow all manufacturers to register chemicals on the inventory. And of course, those who are already registered in the Annex, they had help to do it. And the slogan of REACH is no data, no market. So you don't register, you cannot produce or market in Europe. So TSCA, like I said it before, was created in 1976. And it was created, they had was already a regulation. They had an inventory with active and inactive substance. So all substances that were already registered, they called existing chemicals, and they had all new chemicals. They call new chemicals all that were not listed. It's important to know that they created also the confidential information, what they call CBI, confidential business information, that allows some manufacturers to keep information confidential, and this information won't be found in inventory. The problem with the old TSCA is that they focused on a risk assessment only in new chemicals, and they consider that existing chemicals were already safe. That's why when the Frank-Gutenberg Chemical Safety Act entered into force in 2016, it modified TSCA, focusing on doing risk assessment also in existing chemicals. So what TSCA covers? So now we are going to talk only about TSCA. TSCA will cover all substances in its own or in mixtures, except for those who are regulated by other regulations. For example, food additives, drugs, tobacco, everything related with firearms or radioactive materials and waste, and chemicals in research and development. But it's important to know that one chemical can be subject of 2 different regulations. For example, if you are using an insecticide as a solvent in the industry, it will be subject to TSCA. So it can be, what you must see is the end use of the product. And all the substances must be listed on the TSCA inventory and designated as actives. I put on the right left the definition of substance for TSCA. I won't describe it, but you will see that it's not exactly the same than REACH, but it goes on the same way. So who is concerned by TSCA? Manufacturers, importers, distributors, and processors. And how they will be concerned? All of them for existing chemicals. It means for those who are already on the market. They must maintain a central file of records that must be reviewed periodically. This central file, it's about health or environment reactions to employees and training. They also must submit copies of any health and safety study that is not published yet, This will allow EPA to have information about the hazards of chemicals. And they must also report any substantial risk, like chemical spill, for example. And they only have 30 calendar days to report. And the new TSCA also required to all of them, to manufacturers, importers, and distributors and processors, to send information about the substances in the way of the safety data sheet or other, about the suspected authors of substances that they send. And EPA has the authority to recall or replace immediately hazardous substances that are already in the market if they consider it's dangerous. So for manufacturers and importers, there are specific requirements. They must, for quantities above 10 tons a year, they must also submit a chemical data report every 4 years. And for a new use, they must submit a SNUN, is a significant new use notification. Something that changed also with the new TSCA is that now confidential information is not, it won't be keeping confidential forever. Every manufacturer must claim for this confidential information, and for that they must submit a CBI claim. CBI means confidential business information again, and they must do it every 10 years. When we are talking about export or import, if you are exporting chemicals outside the US, you just need to notify EPA. And if you import, you must do a certification if it's for internal use. But if you want to produce, you must follow you must respect the other requirements, like submit a CDR and so on. So for new chemicals, what you have to do if you are going to manufacture new chemicals, you must submit a pre-manufacture notice and a preliminary assessment information reporting, explaining how you will use, which are the human exposure, disposal practices, and all data you have about the chemicals. Other way, you must submit an exemption notice. So there are some exemptions for the PNN. Is if you are producing a low volume, a low level of exposure, test marketing, biotechnology, or impurities, or only export. For those exceptions, you only must submit an exemption notice. Of course, for quantities about 10 tons a year, you must also submit the chemical data report that you will have to submit every 4 years. And if you want to keep confidential information, you must submit the CBI. Once you start to manufacture or import, the manufacturer have 30 days to submit a notice of commencement, that is NOC, to the EPA. Something that also changed in 2016 is that before the old TSCA had to give an answer after 90 days. If you didn't receive an answer of the EPA, you could start manufacturing. So this rule is no longer applies, and now you really must wait to the EPA answer. So what the EPA will do with all this information, of course, they will evaluate the pre-manufacture notice and the CDR, and they can also require a specific test if they consider that they don't have enough information, but they must justify their choice. They must conduct risk-based review of new chemicals if you present a PMN, but they also must now conduct a risk assessment on existing chemicals. So to resume, the EPA, since 2016, they will determine if a chemical meets the low safety standard and they will give an answer. So labeling requirements or use restrictions or phase outs. This will be done in the way of a SNUR, sometimes a significant new use rule that you can find in the EPA website, and you must respect. Other way, you must present an SNUR, a significant new use notification. So EPA engaged to evaluate 20 substances underway within 3.5 years. So what are the key notions when we are talking about TSCA? Is the inventory of existing chemicals. One portion is public and the other is confidential, so you won't have access. Now, if you want to keep confidential information, you must claim every 10 years. The EPA is required to designate all substances as active or inactive to be sure which substances are on the market. And it's important to know about what means SNUR, significant new use rule that you must respect if you are producing a substance. They are related to only one use, of course. And the PMN if you are if you are producing a new chemical. This is just a resume of what you have to ask yourself. If the chemical is under TSCA, yes or no. If it is in an inventory, yes or no. It exists in a SNUR, do I respect it or not? And we will follow, give you an idea of what you must do. So now we change to REACH. So what does REACH cover? REACH will cover all substances in markets, in its own, in mixtures, or in articles for quantities above 1 ton a year. Except there are exceptions too, for those who are regulated by other regulations, so radioactive substances, waste, substance use of defense, medical device, medical products, animal feed and additives, and so on. And they are accepted to chemicals in research and development. But it's important to know that in Europe, 98% of manufacturers are concerned by REACH because they incorporate or rely on industrial chemicals. So as TSCA, REACH, manufacturers, importers, distributors, and downstream users will be concerned by REACH. Downstream users is what in TSCA call processors. And how they will be concerned. So we have specific requirements again for manufacturers and importers of substances in its own in mixture or contained in an article. Well, for quantities above 1 ton a year, they must submit a technical dossier to ECA. This technical dossier is excuse me, that is for the second one. For quantities about 10 years, they must submit also a technical dossier and a chemical safety report. And the chemical safety report will contain everything related with health, risk assessment, environment assessment, and also about exposure assessment with exposure scenarios. They must describe how the product can be used and in which quantities and so on. Manufacturers also must supply REACH SDS that must respect the Annex 2 of the REACH regulation to customers. And for all substances that are classified as hazardous or substance of very high concern, or they have exposure limits. They also must notify any use of a substance of very high concern in an article for quantities above 1.1% weight to weight. So another difference that we can see with TSCA right now is that there are specific requirements for downstream users. So a downstream user, they must notify any use of a substance of very high concern for a quantity above 0.1 weight%. They must respect exposure scenario in case of an extended safety data sheet. They must notify any new use if the use they do with the substance is not on the safety data sheet. And they must also transmit information through a safety data sheet in all levels of the supply chain. In case of import, I put it in here because there is an exception when you are importing a chemical, but you have an only representative, your supplier has an only representative, you have the status of downstream user. So you will just must answer the downstream user requirements. So there are different categories of downstream users. It can be formulators, end users, producers of articles, or refillers are those who transfer material from one container to another. So all these categories are concerned by REACH, and they must compliance the requirements. So what will the ECA do with all this information? They can also require a specific test if they don't have enough information from the manufacturer, but they don't have to justify. They will check if the registration is complete, and they will assign their registration number of the substance. And they have the responsibility to check compliance, evaluate the proposals, and to do substance assessment by the member states. It's the member states who will do the risk assessment. They must also update the inventory and the chemical list. So we have three, the most important actually, but the chemical list for REACH are the candidate list, that is a list of hazardous substances that are currently under consultation. Once they have been consulted, they will choose if they go to the authorization list. It's a list of hazardous substances that are prohibited to be used. You can only use if you have an authorization, but it's really expensive, and it will be just for a short time, specific time. Or they can go to the restriction list, that is a list of use and manufacturers restrictions applied on a substance. You must also check as downstream user if you are using a chemical substance that is on the candidate list, authorization list, or in the restriction list. So the key notions, they will be the inventory, that you have substances in a zone, but will also be substance in a mixture on articles. The technical dossier for quantities above 1 ton a year, and the CSR for quantities above 10 ton a year. The mandatory safety data sheet information transmission, the extended safety data sheets for quantities above 10 ton a year, the notification of any substance of very high concern, and the compliance of the three lists, candidate, authorization, and restrictions, and the transmission all over the supply chain. So, to conclude, I will talk about the comparisons. So the similarities, both prohibit the manufacture or importation of chemicals that are not on the inventory. We can see it in both legislations. Both will apply to all the steps on the supply chain for substance in its own, in mixture and articles. Even if in TSCA we don't see it is inside because they want to control also in articles. That's the beginning. REACH has defined quantities applied to substance in articles, and in TSCA we have not yet specific quantity or substance defined on articles. When we see also both of agencies require communication all over the supply chain about the status of compliance, but the difference is that in REACH, we must communicate information about substance of very high concern in articles, about candidate lists, and about the safety data sheet and exposure scenario. And in TSCA, the information of hazard, you will communicate only information of hazard of the substance only if required by the statute. We have also, sorry, we don't see it, but we have both agencies also provide a framework for substance classification. In REACH, like they also manage CLP, it will be through CLP, but also through the registration number and the 3 lists. And the EPA option includes labeling requirement. They will, after evaluation, they will give a labeling requirement, use restrictions or phase out, but for the moment they are not speaking about authorization. European Union member states cannot apply more stringent national measures. They must respect REACH. And on the other side, in US, individual states can participate in rulemaking and can make their own laws if they consider that it is stronger than EPA, than TSCA, excuse me. So to resume, US TSCA has improved a lot their management, trying to copy REACH in order to assess the risk of dangerous chemicals that already exist also, not only new chemicals, and to communicate all over the supply chain. REACH has still some lag, but their approach is in a way wider and go beyond just chemical, requiring limit quantities in articles and all over substances life cycle. So I hope you enjoy, excuse me for my English, and thank you very much for your attention.